The notification on my phone screen made my coffee cup freeze halfway to my lips. Another overdraft alert from David's account. The third one this month. I stared at the automatic transfer confirmation that had just gone through, another $2,000 to cover their mortgage payment. Again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But it wasn't the money that made my hands shake as I set down the cup. It was the text message that had arrived 10 minutes earlier, the one I'd accidentally opened thinking it was meant for me. It was from my daughter-in-law Christina to her sister. She's at it again, swooping in to save the day. I swear, Margaret acts like we can't handle our own finances. It's suffocating how she hovers over every little thing. David and I are grown adults, but she treats us like we're still in college. I'm so tired of her monitoring our every move. The words hit me like a physical blow. Suffocating. Monitoring. After everything I'd done, everything I'd sacrificed. To help them build their life together. I sat there in my pristine kitchen in Westfield, Connecticut, surrounded by the silence of my empty house, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. I suppose I should start from the beginning, though. Pinpointing exactly when I became the villain in my own son's story isn't easy. My name is Margaret Whitmore, and at 71, I'd always prided myself on being the kind of mother who supported her children's dreams without being overbearing. Apparently, I'd gotten that calculation terribly wrong. When my husband Robert died 8 years ago, he left me in a position I'd never expected to find myself in. Comfortable. More than comfortable, actually. His life insurance policy, combined with the sale of his successful accounting firm and our carefully managed investments over 37 years of marriage, meant I had more money than I knew what to do with. The house in Westfield was paid off, my needs were modest, and suddenly I found myself sitting on assets worth just over $3 million. Robert had always been the practical one, the planner. During those final months when the cancer was winning, he'd spent hours going over the finances with me, making sure I understood everything. "Take care of yourself first, Maggie," he'd said, using the nickname only he was allowed to use. "But if the kids need help, you'll know what to do." The kids. David was our only child, born when I was 28 and Robert was 30. We'd wanted more children, but it wasn't meant to be. David became our everything, perhaps too much so, though I didn't realize it at the time. He was brilliant, graduating summa cum laude from Yale with a degree in environmental engineering, full of passion for changing the world through sustainable technology. When he married Christina 4 years after college, I was thrilled. She was beautiful, ambitious, working her way up the corporate ladder at a marketing firm in Hartford. They seemed perfect together, young, educated, ready to take on the world. What I didn't anticipate was how expensive taking on the world would become. It started small, the way these things always do. They were looking at houses, but the ones they wanted were just slightly out of their price range. David had landed a good position with an environmental consulting firm, and Christina was doing well, but the housing market in their preferred area of West Hartford was competitive. When they found the perfect colonial on Elm Ridge Road, 4 bedrooms, updated kitchen, walking distance to the elementary school they were already imagining their future children attending, they were short $50,000 for the down payment. "Mom, I hate to ask," David had said over dinner at their cramped apartment, "but we were wondering if you might consider lending us the money for the down payment. We'd pay you back with interest, of course. Better than what you'd get from the bank." I'd agreed immediately. What was $50,000 compared to their happiness? Besides, they were responsible adults with good jobs. It was an investment in their future, in the grandchildren I hoped would someday fill that big house with laughter. The loan became a gift 6 months later when Christina miscarried their first pregnancy. She was devastated, taking several weeks off work, and their budget got tight. "Don't worry about the money," I'd told David when he brought it up awkwardly. Over coffee. "Consider it our contribution to your new home." That should have been the end of it. But life, as I was learning, rarely unfolds according to plan. The requests became more frequent over the next 3 years. There was the kitchen renovation when they discovered water damage behind the dishwasher. The new roof after a particularly brutal winter. Christina's car accident that left them with medical bills their insurance didn't fully cover. Each time, I stepped in gladly. What was the point of having money if you couldn't help your family? When Christina finally got pregnant again, successfully carrying baby Emma to term, I was over the moon. I bought them a new minivan, installed a state-of-the-art security system in their house, and set up a college fund for Emma with an initial deposit of $50,000. When little Samuel arrived 2 years later, I did the same for him. Somewhere along the way, my help became expected rather than appreciated. The grateful phone calls grew shorter. The invitations to family dinners became less frequent. David Started looking uncomfortable whenever I mentioned the various financial assistance I'd provided, while Christina developed an odd habit of changing the subject whenever money came up. I told myself it was natural. They were busy with young children, demanding careers. Of course they were distracted. Of course they took my help for granted. That's what family does, isn't it? You help because you love them, not because you want recognition. But there were signs I should have paid attention to. The way Christina's smile became forced when I offered to pay for their vacation to Disney World. How David started prefacing conversations with, "You don't need to help us with this, but," before asking for help anyway. The increasing frequency of those conversations happening when I wasn't around. The breaking point came during Emma's 6th birthday party last spring. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'd arrived early to help set up, arms full of decorations and a check for $5,000 to cover the elaborate princess party Christina had been stressing about affording. I found them in the kitchen, voices raised in what was clearly an ongoing argument. "She's going to insist on paying for everything again," Christina was saying, her back to the door. "The party, the decorations, probably Emma's entire college tuition if we let her. I can't stand it anymore, David. It's like she doesn't trust us to take care of our own children." "She's just trying to help," David replied, but his tone was weary rather than defensive. "It's not help when it comes with that look," Christina shot back. "That little smile like she's rescuing us from ourselves. Like we're charity cases. And you know she keeps track of every penny. Remember when I helped you with the roof? Remember when I bought you the van? It's manipulation disguised as generosity." I'd backed away from the kitchen door, my heart pounding. Was that really how they saw me? As manipulative? Keeping score? I'd never once reminded them of what I'd spent on them, never once made them feel obligated. Had I? For the rest of that party, I watched them with new eyes. The way Christina's jaw tightened when I offered to pay for the photographer. How David quickly declined when I suggested we hire a catering service for Samuel's upcoming birthday. The careful distance they maintained, accepting my help while clearly resenting it. That night, I lay awake replaying every interaction, every offer of assistance, every gift. Had I been suffocating them without realizing it? Had my desire to help become a need to control? The questions gnawed at me for weeks. I tried pulling back after that. When they mentioned needing a new washing machine, I bit my tongue instead of offering to buy one. When David casually mentioned how expensive summer camps were getting, I changed the subject instead of offering to pay. But the damage seemed already done. If anything, the distance between us grew wider. The final straw came 3 months ago. During what should have been a lovely family dinner at their house. Emma had just started 1st grade, and Samuel was beginning preschool. They were talking about the costs involved, new school clothes, supplies, the preschool tuition that was apparently more expensive than they'd anticipated. "We're thinking of pulling Samuel out," Christina said, pushing food around her plate. "Maybe I could watch him at home and work part-time instead. The tuition is just too much right now with David's student loans and the mortgage." Every instinct in me wanted to jump in, to offer to pay the tuition, to solve their problem as I'd solved so many others. But I remembered their words from Emma's party, the resentment I'd heard in Christina's voice. So I stayed quiet, offering only sympathetic murmurs. The next week, I received a text from David that made my stomach drop. "Mom, I hate to ask again, but could you help us with Samuel's tuition? Just for this semester while we figure things out?" I'd stared at that text for hours. They resented my help, called it suffocating and manipulative, but they still needed it. Still asked for it. The contradiction was maddening. I'd agreed, of course. Transferred the money within an hour. But something had changed in me. The joy I'd once felt in helping them was replaced by a hollow feeling, a sense that I was enabling something unhealthy for all of us. That's when I started paying closer attention to their finances. Not snooping, exactly, but being more aware of the patterns. I had access to David's bank account, a leftover arrangement from when I'd been helping them with their budget during the early years of their marriage. I'd never removed myself because they'd never asked me to, and occasionally they'd need me to transfer money directly when they were traveling or unable to get to the bank. What I discovered made my heart sink. They weren't just living paycheck to paycheck despite both having good salaries, they were actively living beyond their means. Designer clothes for the children, expensive dinners out twice a week, a country club membership they somehow thought was necessary for networking. Meanwhile, they were consistently short on mortgage payments, relying on my automatic transfers to cover the difference. The overdraft alerts became my weekly routine. 2,000 here, 1,500 there, occasionally a larger sum when something unexpected came up. In the past 6 months alone, I'd transferred over $30,000 into their account. Not gifts anymore, not even acknowledged loans, just silent subsidies of a lifestyle they couldn't actually afford. And they called my help suffocating. The morning I read Christina's text to her sister, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, watching the October sunlight slant across the granite countertops Robert and I had picked out together 20 years ago. Everything in this house was a reminder of careful planning, of living within our means while still enjoying life's pleasures. We'd worked hard for every piece of furniture, every upgrade, every luxury. We'd saved and invested and been patient. Our son, apparently, had learned none of those lessons. I picked up my phone and did something I'd never done before. I opened my banking app and removed David's account from my automatic transfer list. Then I changed my PIN and passwords. For the first time in 8 years, my money was truly my own. Again. The next step was harder. I drafted a text to David, deleted it, drafted another. How do you tell your child that their perception of your love as suffocating has suffocated your willingness to provide it? Finally, I settled on something simple. David, I need to speak with you and Christina. Are you free for coffee tomorrow morning? Just the adults, maybe Emma and Samuel could visit their cousins for a few hours. His response came quickly, of course, Mom. Is everything okay? I almost laughed at the question. Was everything okay? My son and daughter-in-law thought I was a manipulative control freak who couldn't respect their independence, while simultaneously depending on my money to maintain their lifestyle. Nothing about this situation was okay. We'll talk tomorrow, I replied. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my sister Rebecca in Portland, Oregon. Rebecca was 5 years younger than me, with 3 children of her own who were all successfully launched into independent adulthood. She'd always been the more direct one in our family, less inclined to sugarcoat uncomfortable truths. Maggie. Her voice was warm with surprise. This is unexpected. What's going on? I found myself telling her everything. The years of financial help, the overheard conversations, the text message that morning. Rebecca listened without interrupting, making only small sounds of acknowledgement as I unloaded 8 years of accumulated confusion and hurt. When I finished, there was a long pause. Finally, Rebecca spoke, her voice gentle but firm. Oh, honey. You've been enabling them. The word hit me like a slap. Enabling? I was helping them. You were solving their problems instead of letting them learn to solve their own, Rebecca interrupted. And worse, you were teaching them that actions don't have consequences. They can spend beyond their means because Mom will always bail them out. They can buy things they can't afford because the money will magically appear when they need it. I felt tears starting, which was ridiculous. I was 71 years old, too old to cry about family drama. But they're struggling, Rebecca. They have young children, a mortgage, they have good jobs and more financial support than most families ever see, Rebecca said bluntly. The reason they're struggling is because they've never had to live within their actual means. Why would they budget carefully when they know you'll cover their shortfalls? The truth of her words was painful to acknowledge. So what do I do? Now? You stop. Today. Immediately. And you don't apologize for it. Rebecca's voice was firm. They called your help suffocating? Fine. Let them breathe freely without it. After we hung up, I sat in Robert's old recliner, the one I'd never had the heart to get rid of, and thought about the man I'd loved for 37 years. Robert had been generous but never foolish with money. He'd helped people, but always in ways that encouraged their independence rather than dependence. If he were here now, what would he say about what I'd allowed our son's family to become? I knew the answer, and it wasn't comfortable. The next morning, David and Christina arrived at my house at exactly 10 o'clock, both looking slightly nervous. Christina carried a small gift bag, homemade cookies, probably, or a scented candle from the expensive boutique she favored. Peace. Offerings that cost money they didn't actually have. I served coffee in the living room, the formal one I rarely used anymore. The setting felt appropriate for what I had to say, serious, official, definitive. I asked you here because we need to discuss our financial arrangement, I began without preamble. Or rather, the end of our financial arrangement. David's coffee cup rattled against its saucer. What do you mean? I mean that as of yesterday, I've removed your account from my automatic transfer list. I've changed my banking passwords. There will be no more emergency funds, no more bailouts, no more subsidies of any kind. Christina's face went white. Margaret, if this is about the preschool tuition, this is about a text message you sent to your sister yesterday, I said calmly. The one where you described my help as suffocating. Where you said I treat you like children who can't handle their own finances. The silence that followed was deafening. David looked genuinely confused, but Christina's expression shifted quickly from shock to guilt to defensive anger. You read my private messages? You sent it to the wrong number. I replied. It came to me instead of your sister. Though I have to say, it was enlightening to learn how you really feel about my support all these years. David was staring at his wife with something approaching horror. Christina, you didn't, she did, I confirmed. And honestly, she wasn't entirely wrong. I have been treating you like children who can't handle their own finances. The difference is, I thought I was being helpful. Apparently, I was being suffocating instead. Mom, look, I'm sure there's been a misunderstanding, David started, but I held up my hand. There's no misunderstanding. Your wife finds my financial support suffocating. She resents my monitoring of your situation. She thinks I'm manipulative and controlling. I kept my voice level, professional even. So I'm solving that problem. No more suffocation. No more monitoring. No more control. Christina had found her voice again. You're cutting us off because of one text message? That's incredibly petty. I'm respecting your independence, I interrupted. Isn't that what you wanted? The freedom to handle your own finances without my interference? The logic was undeniable, and Christina seemed to realize it. Her mouth opened and closed a few times before she managed, but the mortgage payment is due next week. And Samuel's tuition are no longer my responsibility, I finished. You're both intelligent adults with good jobs. I'm sure you'll figure it out. David looked like he was going to be sick. Mom, I had no idea Christina felt that way about your help. But we really do need, what you need, I said firmly, is to learn to live within your means. What you need is to understand that choices have consequences. What you need is to stop depending on me to subsidize a lifestyle you can't actually afford. I stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. I love you both. I love Emma and Samuel. But I'm done being taken for granted while simultaneously being resented for my generosity. Christina's face was flushed with anger now. So this is it? You're abandoning your own grandchildren because your feelings got hurt? The accusation stung, but I kept my composure. I'm not abandoning anyone. I'm simply stopping my financial contributions to a family that finds them suffocating. My love for my grandchildren was never contingent on paying your bills. But what are we supposed to do? David asked, his voice almost pleading. What every other family does, I replied. Budget. Prioritize. Make hard choices. Live within your actual means instead of your imagined ones. I walked them to the door, my heart breaking at the panic in David's eyes and the fury in Christina's. But beneath the pain, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, relief. The weight of constant financial vigilance, of monitoring their accounts and covering their shortfalls, had lifted from my shoulders. I hope you'll reconsider, David said at the door. We can talk about this, work something out. There's nothing to work out, I replied gently. You're adults. Act like it. After they left, I sat in my quiet house and waited to feel regret. Instead, I felt something like peace. For the first time in 8 years, my money was truly mine. For the first time since Robert's death, I wasn't defined by my willingness to solve other people's problems. I picked up my phone and called my financial advisor. It was time to make some plans for myself. The next week was instructive. My phone buzzed constantly with texts from David, each one more desperate than the last. The mortgage payment had been declined. Samuel's preschool had called about overdue tuition. Their credit cards were maxed out. Christina's sister couldn't lend them money. Did I know how much stress I was causing their family? I responded to none of them. Rebecca called every few days to check on me, offering encouragement when my resolve wavered. They're learning, she reminded me when I confided how hard it was to ignore David's increasingly frantic messages. For the first time in their adult lives, they're actually facing the consequences of their choices. It's necessary, even if it's painful to watch. 2 weeks after our confrontation, Christina showed up at my door alone. She looked exhausted, her usually perfect appearance slightly disheveled. I invited her in despite my better judgment. I came to apologize, she said without preamble. About the text message. About everything, really. I waited, saying nothing. I was wrong to call your help suffocating, she continued. I was frustrated and I took it out on you, and that wasn't fair. You've been incredibly generous over the years, and I should have been more grateful. But, I prompted, sensing there was more. Christina's careful composure cracked slightly. But we really do need help, Margaret. David's been working overtime, I've taken on freelance projects, but we can't make up the shortfall fast enough. The bank is threatening foreclosure proceedings. Samuel's preschool has given us 2 weeks to catch up on tuition or they'll remove him from the program. I felt the familiar tug of sympathy, the ingrained desire to swoop in and solve their problems. But Rebecca's words echoed in my mind, they're learning. I'm sorry to hear that, I said sincerely. It sounds very stressful. Christina waited for me to offer help. When I didn't, her expression hardened. So that's it? You're really going to let us lose our house? I'm not letting you do anything, I replied calmly. Your financial choices are your own, just as you wanted. The consequences of those choices are also your own. We could lose everything, she said, her voice rising. Then maybe you should sell some things, I suggested. The country club membership you can't afford. The designer clothes in Emma's closet. The luxury SUV that costs more than most people's annual salary. Christina's face went red. Those are investments in our family's future. No, I interrupted. Those are expenses you can't afford. There's a difference. She left angry, but I noticed she didn't argue with my assessment of their spending priorities. That, at least, was progress. Over the following weeks, I watched from a distance as David and Christina scrambled to restructure their lives. David took on a second job doing weekend consulting work. Christina increased her freelance hours and, according to Emma, who mentioned it during a brief phone call, started selling some of her expensive handbags online. They listed the country club membership for sale. They traded Christina's luxury SUV for a more modest used car. They started shopping at discount stores instead of the upscale boutiques they'd previously favored. It was painful to watch, but also oddly satisfying. For the first time in their marriage, they were behaving like adults who understood that money was finite and choices had consequences. A month after Christina's visit, David called me. Not to ask for money, but to talk. I understand now, he said without preamble. What you were trying to teach us. Christina and we got comfortable living beyond our means because we knew you'd always be there to catch us. And now? I asked. Now we're learning to budget. Really budget, not just pretend to while. Knowing you'd cover our mistakes. He paused. It's harder than I thought it would be. But also liberating, somehow? We're making our own decisions, living with our own choices. How do you feel about that? Scared, he admitted. But also proud. We saved Samuel's preschool spot by cutting other expenses. We negotiated a payment plan with the bank for the mortgage. Christina got a promotion at work because she's been taking on more projects. We're actually handling our problems instead of just waiting for someone else to solve them. I felt tears pricking my eyes, but they were good tears this time. I'm proud of you too, David. I want to apologize, he continued. For taking your help for granted. For not appreciating what you were doing for us. And for letting Christina's resentment go unchecked. I should have shut down those conversations instead of just listening to them. Apology accepted, I said. But more importantly, what did you learn from all this? That independence isn't just about not wanting help, he replied thoughtfully. It's about being capable of managing without help. We thought we were independent because we had jobs and a house and made our own decisions. But we weren't really, were we? We were just dependent on you instead of dependent on our parents' direct support. The insight impressed me. And now? Now we're actually independent. It's scarier, but it's real. He paused. Would you be willing to have dinner with us this weekend? Just family dinner, no agenda. The kids miss their grandmother. I agreed, though I made it clear that my financial boundaries remained unchanged. I was done being their safety net. But I wasn't done being their family. That Saturday, I drove to their house for the first time in 2 months. The changes were immediately apparent. The lawn service was gone, David was mowing their grass himself. Christina answered the door wearing jeans and a simple sweater instead of her usual designer outfits. The house was still beautiful, but there were small economies everywhere, generic brands in the pantry. Fewer expensive decorative objects, a television that was clearly several years old instead of the latest model. But what struck me most was the atmosphere. There was an energy in the house that had been missing before, a sense of accomplishment. Of pride in what they'd achieved through their own efforts. Emma and Samuel ran to hug me, full of stories about their new routines. Samuel loved his preschool, where he'd stayed thanks to his parents' efforts rather than his grandmother's money. Emma was excited about the community center activities. She'd been enrolled in instead of the expensive private programs they could no longer afford. During dinner, Christina actually thanked me. For what? I asked, genuinely curious. For forcing us to grow up, she said simply. I was angry at first, obviously. But you were right about everything. We were living like children pretending to be adults, spending money we didn't have because we knew you'd always be there to cover our mistakes. It must have been frustrating, I said, knowing that your independence was an illusion. Christina nodded. The worst part was that I knew it, deep down. That's why I was so resentful of your help. It reminded me that we weren't really making it on our own. She looked at David, then back at me. I'm sorry for that text message. But I'm also grateful it happened, because it forced this conversation we should have had years ago. As the evening wound down, David walked me to my car. "There's something else I wanted to tell you," he said. "Christina and I have been talking about our financial goals now that we're actually managing our own money. We want to start saving for the kids' college funds ourselves. And we want to build an emergency fund so we never have to depend on anyone else again." "Those are excellent goals," I said, and meant it. "We were also wondering." He hesitated. "Would you be willing to have coffee with us once a month? Not to talk about money, just to talk. Family conversations without the financial stress hanging over everything." I agreed immediately. The thought of rebuilding our relationship on healthier terms filled me with hope. Driving home that night, I reflected on the journey we'd all taken over the past few months. David and Christina had learned to live within their means, to face consequences, to find satisfaction in solving their own problems. I had learned the difference between helping and enabling, between generosity and control. But perhaps most importantly, I had rediscovered my own identity separate from my role as the family ATM. For the first time since Robert's death, I was making plans for myself, using my money for my own dreams rather than constantly watching for the next family crisis to solve. The irony wasn't lost on me. By cutting off their access to my money, I had given them something far more valuable, true independence. And by refusing to be suffocated by their resentment of my help, I had found my own freedom as well. In the end, the best gift I could give my family wasn't my money, it was my trust in their ability to succeed without it. And the best gift I could give myself was the rediscovery of a life that belonged entirely to me. It had taken 71 years and one very painful text message, but I had finally learned the difference between love and enabling. And I had chosen love, the kind that empowers rather than diminishes, that trusts rather than rescues, that builds strength rather than dependence. My son's wife had said I was suffocating their independence. In the end, she was right. But the solution wasn't what any of us had expected. By suffocating their access to my money, I had given them the space to finally breathe on their own. The silence in my house had never felt so complete. 3 months had passed since I'd cut off David and Christina's financial access, and while my phone no longer buzzed with desperate requests for money transfers, it also rarely rang at all. The quiet that had once felt peaceful now carried an undertone of isolation that I was struggling to navigate. I stood at my kitchen window on a crisp January morning, watching snow accumulate on the bird feeder Robert had installed 15 years ago. The cardinals and chickadees that visited daily seemed unaffected by the cold, going about their business with a resilience I found myself envying. They adapted to whatever conditions they faced without complaint or expectation that someone else would solve their problems. My coffee had grown cold while I'd been lost in thought, a habit that had developed since the family crisis began. Everything felt different now, not just my relationship with David and Christina, but my entire sense of purpose. For 8 years, I'd structured my days around being available for their emergencies, their needs, their financial shortfalls. Now that those responsibilities were gone, I found myself facing questions I'd been avoiding since Robert's death. What did I want to do with the rest of my life? The doorbell rang, startling me from my contemplation. Through the frosted glass, I could see the outline of someone small and bundled in winter clothes. When I opened the door, I found Mrs. Chen from 3 houses down, holding a covered dish and wearing an expression of determined friendliness. "Margaret, dear," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I brought you some soup. Homemade wonton, my grandmother's recipe. You look like you've lost weight." Linda Chen was 75, a retired nurse who had moved to Westfield 5 years ago to be closer to her daughter's family. We'd exchanged pleasantries at the mailbox and helped each other with occasional favors, but we'd never been what you'd call close friends. Her unexpected visit caught me off guard. "That's very thoughtful," I said, accepting the warm container. "But I'm fine, really. Just been busy with things." Linda gave me a look that probably served her well during her nursing career, kind but penetrating. "Margaret, I've been watching you for months. You barely leave the house except for groceries. Your son used to visit regularly with those beautiful children, but I haven't seen them since before Christmas. And yesterday I saw you standing at the same window for over an hour, just staring outside." The accuracy of her observations was unsettling. Had I really become so predictable in my isolation? "I've been going through some family issues," I admitted reluctantly. "Family issues have a way of consuming us if we let them," Linda said, settling onto my sofa without being invited. "When my husband died, I spent 2 years waiting for my children to need me the way they had when they were young. But they didn't, of course. They had their own lives, their own problems to solve. I nearly disappeared into that waiting." Her words hit closer to home than I cared to admit. What changed? I realized I was grieving not just my husband, but my identity as someone whose worth came from being needed, Linda replied matter-of-factly. So I decided to need myself instead. Started taking classes, volunteering, making new friends. Discovered I was more interesting than I'd given myself credit for. She stood up, apparently having delivered whatever message she'd come to share. There's a book club that meets at the library every Thursday evening. We're starting a new novel next week, something called the Thursday Murder Club. You should come. After she left, I found myself holding the container of soup and thinking about what she'd said. Had I really been waiting for my family to need me? Had my entire identity become wrapped up in being their financial solution? The thought was uncomfortable but undeniable. Since Robert's death, I'd measured my worth by my usefulness to others, particularly to David and Christina. Without that role, I felt adrift, unsure of who Margaret Whitmore was supposed to be when she wasn't solving someone else's problems. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in months. I drove to the library and asked about the book club Linda had mentioned. The librarian, a cheerful woman in her 50s named Patricia, was delighted to add me to their list. We're always looking for new perspectives, she said, handing me a copy of the book. The group has 8 regular members, all women, ages ranging from 62 to 81. Very welcoming group, though they do get passionate about their literary opinions. Walking home with the book tucked under my arm, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time, anticipation about something that had nothing to do with my family's problems. It was a small step, but it felt significant. The first book club meeting was both terrifying and exhilarating. I'd forgotten how nervous I could feel in a room full of strangers, how rusty my social skills had become. But the women, ranging from a retired teacher to a former engineer to a widow who'd run her own catering business, welcomed me with genuine warmth. The discussion was lively, sometimes heated, always engaging. I found myself contributing thoughts I didn't even know I had about character motivation and plot development. When Eleanor, the former teacher, mentioned how the main character's relationship with money reflected deeper issues about control and self-worth, I felt an uncomfortable recognition. Money can become a weapon when we're not careful, said Joan, the widow who'd run the catering business. I used to hire my son to do jobs around my house that I could have done myself or hired strangers to do more cheaply. It took me years to realize I was buying his attention because I was afraid to ask for it directly. The conversation continued. Around the circle, each woman sharing insights that seemed to come from deep personal experience. When it was my turn to speak, I found myself being more honest than I'd intended. I think I've been using money to maintain relationships that might not have survived on their own merits, I said quietly. It's taken me until now to understand the difference between generosity and manipulation, even when the manipulation isn't conscious. The nods around the circle told me I wasn't alone in this realization. After the meeting, Joan approached me as we bundled into our winter coats. Would you like to get coffee sometime this week? I have a feeling we might have more to talk about. Coffee with Joan turned into weekly coffee dates, which turned into a friendship that filled a gap I hadn't even realized existed in my life. Joan had faced similar challenges with her 3 adult children, learning to step back from their problems and rediscover her own interests. She'd started taking art classes at the community center, joined a hiking group, and even tried online dating briefly before deciding she preferred her independence. The hardest part, she told me over our 3rd coffee meeting, was learning to be selfish in healthy ways. I'd spent so many years putting everyone else's needs first that I'd forgotten I had needs of my own. Through Joan, I met other women who were navigating similar transitions. There was Susan, whose retirement from teaching had left her feeling purposeless until she started tutoring immigrant children. Margaret, a name we shared, which created instant bonding, had discovered a passion for genealogy research after her husband died. Carol had started a small business making artisanal soaps, something she'd always wanted to try but never had time for while managing her family's endless crises. Gradually, I began to see my situation differently. Instead of viewing my estrangement from David and Christina as a loss, I started to see it as an opportunity. For the first time in 8 years, my time and energy belonged entirely to me. The question was, what did I want to do with them? The answer came unexpectedly during a conversation with my financial advisor, James Morrison, whom I'd been meeting with quarterly since Robert's death. James had always been professional but somewhat impersonal, focusing on investment performance and tax strategies. But during our February meeting, he asked a question that caught me off guard. Margaret, forgive me if this is too personal, but you seem different lately. More engaged, I suppose. Are you considering any major changes in your life? I found myself telling him about the book club, my new friendships, the way I was beginning to think about my future differently. He listened with unexpected interest. Have you ever considered philanthropy? He asked when I finished. Not just writing checks to established charities, but getting personally involved in causes that matter to you? You have the resources to make a real difference, and it sounds like you might have the time and inclination now as well. The suggestion intrigued me. Robert and I had always donated to various causes, but it had been relatively passive, annual contributions to the local hospital, the library, a few national charities. I'd never thought about taking a more active role. What kind of involvement do you mean? I asked. James leaned forward, his professional demeanor giving way to genuine enthusiasm. There are so many possibilities. You could fund scholarships for underprivileged students, support programs for seniors aging in place, contribute to financial literacy education, something that might be particularly meaningful given your recent family experiences. The last suggestion struck a chord. How many families were struggling with the same issues David and Christina had faced? How many parents were enabling their adult children without realizing it? How many young couples were living beyond their means because no one had taught them the difference between wants and needs? Tell me more about financial literacy programs, I said. Over the next hour, James outlined various possibilities. I could fund workshops at community centers, support programs in local schools, or even develop something entirely new. The idea of turning my painful experience with David and Christina into something that could help other families was appealing. That night, I called Rebecca to discuss the idea. My sister listened thoughtfully as I explained what James had suggested. It sounds perfect for you, she said when I finished. You've always been good with money, and you certainly understand the family dynamics involved now better than most people ever will. But would I be qualified to do something like that? I asked. I don't have any formal education in finance or family counseling. You have something better, Rebecca replied. You have real experience, both as someone who managed money successfully and as someone who learned hard lessons about the unintended consequences of financial enabling. That's worth more than any degree. Her confidence bolstered my own growing conviction. Over the following weeks, I began researching financial literacy programs in Connecticut and beyond. What I discovered was both encouraging and alarming. While there were programs available, most focused on basic budgeting skills for low-income families or debt management for people already in financial crisis, very few addressed the complex family dynamics that had characterized my situation. With David and Christina, I started reading everything I could find about financial psychology, family systems theory, and intergenerational money issues. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that there was a real need for programs that addressed the emotional and relational aspects of money management, not just the technical skills. My book club friends became my informal focus group. As I developed my ideas, during one Thursday evening discussion, I tentatively mentioned what I was considering. That's brilliant, said Eleanor immediately. Do you know how many of us have similar stories? I paid for my daughter's graduate school because she said she couldn't afford it, only to find out later she was taking expensive vacations while I covered her tuition. My son bought a boat he couldn't afford because he knew I'd help with his mortgage when he couldn't make the payments, added Susan. I thought I was being supportive. Really, I was teaching him that his decisions didn't have real consequences. Story after story emerged, each variation on the same theme, well-meaning parents whose financial help had become enablement, adult children who'd never learned to live within their means because someone always rescued them from their poor choices. You should definitely do this, Joan said firmly. But you should start with us. Offer a workshop here in Westfield first, see how it goes. Test your ideas with people you know before you try to take it broader. The suggestion made perfect sense. Over the next month, I developed a curriculum for what I decided to call Money and Family, Navigating Financial Relationships Across Generations. The program would consist of 6 two-hour workshops covering topics like distinguishing between helping and enabling, setting financial boundaries with adult children, and teaching financial responsibility across generations. Patricia at the library was enthusiastic about hosting the first series. We've had requests for programs like this, she told me. People are hungry for these conversations, but they're often too embarrassed to seek help individually. The first workshop was scheduled for a Saturday morning in March. I was terrified. What if no one came? What if my ideas were naive or wrong? What if I made a fool of myself trying to teach others when my own family situation was still unresolved? But as I sat in my quiet house the night before, preparing my notes and materials, I realized something important had shifted. For the first time since Robert's death, I was excited about something that belonged entirely to me. Not my role as David's mother or Emma and Samuel's grandmother, but my own identity as someone who might have something valuable to offer the world. The morning of the first workshop, I arrived at the library early to set up chairs and arrange materials. My hands were shaking slightly as I wrote the workshop title on the whiteboard, but underneath the nervousness was a deep sense of rightness. This felt like what I was supposed to be doing. At exactly 10 o'clock, people began arriving. Linda Chin came, of course, bringing 2 friends from her bridge club. Joan and Eleanor from the book club settled into seats near the front. But there were also strangers, a middle-aged couple I didn't recognize, an elderly man who looked uncomfortable but determined, a woman about my age who seemed to be fighting back tears before we even began. By the time I started speaking, 15 people had gathered, more than I dared to hope for. I began with my own story, sharing the basics of what had happened with David and Christina without revealing identifying details. The relief on faces around the room told me I'd made the right choice in being vulnerable first. How many of you have found yourselves in similar situations? I asked after finishing my introduction. Every hand in the room went up. What followed was 2 hours of the most honest, painful, and ultimately healing conversation I'd participated in since Robert's death. Parents shared stories of adult children who expected constant financial bailouts. Adult children talked about the resentment they felt toward parents whose help felt controlling. Grandparents described the guilt they felt about setting boundaries that might affect their relationships with grandchildren. The woman who'd been fighting tears turned out to be Janet, whose daughter was 35 and had never held a job for more than 6 months because Janet always covered her living expenses. The elderly man, George, had been supporting his son's gambling addiction for years by paying his rent and utilities whenever the son lost money at the casino. I keep telling myself I'm helping, Janet said through tears. But I think I'm really just enabling her to avoid growing up. The question isn't whether you're helping, I replied, drawing on insights I'd gained through my own painful experience. The question is whether your help is building her capacity to help herself or reducing it. The distinction resonated throughout the room. We spent time discussing practical strategies for setting boundaries, scripts for difficult conversations, and ways to offer support that encouraged independence rather than dependence. As the workshop ended and people began gathering their things, the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. Janet approached me with tears in her eyes. I've been struggling with this for years, she said. My friends either tell me to cut her off completely or that I should keep helping because she's my daughter. You're the first person who's helped me understand there might be a middle path. George shook my hand gravely. This is the first time I've talked about my son's problems with anyone who understood. My wife thinks I'm being heartless for considering cutting off the money. But you helped me see that I might actually be being heartless by continuing to enable him. The couple I hadn't recognized introduced themselves as Tom and Marie Phillips. Their son was a successful lawyer who nevertheless constantly asked for money to maintain a lifestyle his income couldn't support. We thought we were the only ones dealing with this, Marie said. It helps to know we're not alone. As I drove home that afternoon, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval or gratitude. I had identified a problem, developed a solution, and executed it successfully. The satisfaction was entirely my own. But more than that, I had discovered something about myself I'd forgotten. I was capable of more than just writing checks. I had insights worth sharing, experiences that could help others, skills that extended beyond my ability to solve problems with money. The success of the first workshop led to requests for more. Patricia asked me to develop an ongoing monthly series. Linda Chen's daughter, who worked at a community center in Hartford, invited me to offer the program there. Word spread through networks I didn't even know existed, financial advisors who'd been looking for resources to recommend to clients struggling with family money issues, therapists who specialized in family dynamics, elder law attorneys who dealt with the legal consequences of financial enablement. Within 6 months, I was facilitating workshops throughout central Connecticut. I developed materials for different audiences: parents who were worried about enabling their children, adult children who felt controlled by parental financial assistance, and couples who disagreed about how much help to provide to their extended families. Each workshop taught me something new, both about the complexity of family financial dynamics and about my own capabilities. I learned to handle difficult emotions: the anger of parents whose adult children had stolen from them, the shame of grown children who'd never learned to support themselves, the grief of grandparents who worried that setting boundaries might cost them relationships with grandchildren. I also learned to trust my instincts. When participants challenged my suggestions or argued with my conclusions, I found myself responding with confidence rather than defensiveness. The painful experience with David and Christina had given me a depth of understanding that couldn't be argued away. More importantly, I was building something that was entirely mine. Not a response to someone else's crisis or need, but a proactive contribution to solving problems I cared about. The workshops were filling not just my time but my sense of purpose, in ways I hadn't experienced since Robert's illness had begun consuming our lives years earlier. One evening in late summer, as I was driving home from a particularly challenging workshop where a mother had broken down sobbing about her son's heroin addiction and how her financial support was enabling his drug use, my phone rang. David's name appeared on the dashboard display. I almost didn't answer. We'd spoken occasionally over the past few months, brief, polite conversations about the children's activities or household updates. But nothing substantial, nothing that addressed the fundamental changes in our relationship. "Hi, David," I said, activating the hands-free system. "Mom, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," he began, his voice carrying an unfamiliar note of hesitation. "Just driving home from work," I replied, then realized how that sounded. "Well, from a workshop I was facilitating." "Right, Christina mentioned you were doing some kind of teaching now. Financial stuff?" "Financial literacy with a focus on family dynamics," I confirmed. "It's been fulfilling." There was a pause before David spoke again. "Mom, I was calling because Christina and I have been talking, and we realized we never properly thanked you." "For what?" "For cutting us off," he said simply. "I know that sounds strange, but it's true. We've learned so much about ourselves over the past year. About money, about responsibility, about what it means to actually be independent adults." I felt tears prick my eyes but kept my voice steady. "How are things going?" "Better than I would have thought possible," David replied. And I could hear the pride in his voice. "We paid off our credit cards last month. We've built up a small emergency fund. Christina got another promotion, and I'm being considered for a supervisory position at work. We're even talking about maybe buying a smaller house in a less expensive neighborhood so we can reduce our mortgage payments." "That's wonderful, David. I'm proud of you both." "The thing is," he continued, "we keep thinking about how differently things might have turned out if you hadn't forced us to face reality. We probably would have kept spending money we didn't have, kept depending on you to bail us out, kept avoiding the hard work of actually managing our finances. You would have figured it out eventually," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. "Maybe. But maybe not until it was too late, until we'd lost everything and damaged our relationship with you beyond repair." His voice grew more thoughtful. "Christina wants to apologize to you properly. In person. Would you be willing to have dinner with us soon? Just the family, no agenda other than spending time together." I realized I wanted that very much. "I'd like that." "Good. How about this Saturday?" "I'll cook this time, I've actually gotten pretty good at it since we started eating out less." After we hung up, I sat in my driveway for several minutes before going inside. The conversation had stirred emotions I'd been carefully managing for months. Relief that David and Christina were truly thriving on their own. Pride in their accomplishments. Cautious hope that we might rebuild our relationship on healthier terms. But underlying all of that was a deeper realization: I no longer needed their approval or gratitude to feel good about the choices I'd made. The work I was doing, the community I was building, the sense of purpose I'd discovered, these things existed independently of my family relationships. I had become someone whose worth wasn't contingent on being needed by others. Saturday evening arrived with the first hint of autumn in the air. I drove to David and Christina's house with a small gift, not money or anything expensive, but a book about teaching financial responsibility to children that I thought they might find useful. The changes in their home were immediately apparent. The expensive art that had once adorned their walls had been replaced with family photos and Emma's drawings. The furniture was still nice but no longer represented the latest trends. There was a comfortable, lived-in quality that hadn't been there before. Emma and Samuel greeted me with enthusiasm, full of stories about school and friends and the garden they'd helped their father plant in the backyard. They seemed happier, more grounded somehow, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what was different. During dinner, a simple but delicious meal David had clearly prepared himself, Christina addressed the elephant in the room directly. "Margaret, I owe you an enormous apology," she began, her voice steady but emotional. "Not just for the text message, though that was inexcusable. But for years of taking your generosity for granted, for resenting help I should have been grateful. For never recognizing the sacrifice you were making to support us." "You don't need to," I started, but she held up her hand. "Please let me finish. I've been thinking about this for months." She took a breath. "The truth is, I was ashamed of needing help, and it was easier to be angry at you for providing it than to deal with my own feelings of inadequacy. I blamed you for making me feel small when really I was making myself small by refusing to take responsibility for our choices." Her honesty was unexpected and moving. "I appreciate you saying that, Christina. But I wasn't entirely innocent in this situation. I did use my financial help as a way to stay involved in your lives, to feel needed. That wasn't fair to any of us." David nodded thoughtfully. "I think we all learned some hard lessons this year. But the result has been worth it. We're actually a stronger family now, aren't we? Looking around the table at my son and daughter-in-law who were finally living within their means, at my grandchildren who seemed more secure despite having fewer material luxuries, I had to agree. The forced separation had given all of us space to grow in ways that might never have happened otherwise. There's something else, Christina said as we cleared the dishes. David and I have been talking about the work you're doing now. The financial literacy workshops. What about them? We'd like to help, David said. Not financially, we're nowhere near ready for that kind of contribution. But Christina has a background in marketing, and I understand the family dynamics you're addressing better than I wish I did. We thought maybe we could volunteer our time. The offer surprised me. You'd want to be involved? We'd like to give back, Christina explained. To help other families avoid the mistakes we made. And honestly, it would feel good to contribute to something you're passionate about instead of just being on the receiving end of your generosity. I found myself deeply moved by the suggestion. Not because I needed their help, though their skills would certainly be useful, but because it represented a complete shift in our relationship dynamic. Instead of them needing things from me, we would be working together toward a common goal. I'd like that very much, I said. As the evening wound down and I prepared to leave, Emma ran up to me with a drawing she'd made, a picture of our family standing together, all stick figures holding hands and smiling. At the bottom, in her careful first-grade handwriting, she'd written, "I love my family." It's beautiful, sweetheart, I told her, genuinely moved by the simple representation of connection and love. Driving home that night, I reflected on how much had changed in the past year. I'd started the journey feeling hurt and unappreciated, focused on what I was losing by cutting off David and Christina's financial support. But what I'd gained was immeasurably more valuable, a sense of purpose, meaningful work, genuine friendships, and ultimately a healthier relationship with my family. The woman who had sat in her kitchen reading that hurtful text message felt like someone from a different lifetime. That Margaret had been defined by her willingness to solve other people's problems with money. This Margaret was defined by her ability to help people solve their own problems with wisdom, insight, and support that went far deeper than financial assistance. My phone buzzed with a text message as I pulled into my garage. It was from Joan, book club emergency meeting tomorrow night. Eleanor's picked another murder mystery, but this one's set in a retirement community. We need backup to argue for something more literary. Can you come armed with alternative suggestions? I laughed out loud at the mock urgency, then typed back, absolutely. I have some ideas about books that deal with family financial dynamics. Time to broaden our horizons. As I headed into my house, my quiet, peaceful house that no longer felt empty but rather full of possibilities, I realized I was looking forward to tomorrow in a way I hadn't for years. Not because someone needed me to solve their problems, but because I had work to do, friends to see, contributions to make. I had discovered that the best way to stop being suffocated by other people's expectations was to start breathing freely in a life of my own choosing. And for the first time since Robert's death, I was truly excited about what the future might hold. The autumn light filtered through the conference room windows at Hartford Community Center as I watched 23 people take their seats for what had become my most requested workshop, Breaking the Cycle, When Love Becomes Enablement. 18 months had passed since that first tentative session at the Westfield Library, and the program had grown beyond anything I'd initially imagined. David sat in the back row, laptop open, taking notes not as my son but as the volunteer coordinator he'd become for the program. Christina had arrived early to set up the registration table, her marketing background proving invaluable as word about the workshops spread throughout Connecticut and into neighboring states. Watching them work together to support something I'd built from scratch filled me with a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with maternal pride and everything to do with mutual respect between equals. Before we begin today, I addressed the group, my voice carrying the confidence that had developed through months of facilitating these difficult conversations. I want to acknowledge that everyone in this room is here because they love someone. The challenge we're facing isn't a lack of love, it's learning how to love in ways that help rather than harm. In the front row, a woman named Patricia wiped her eyes before I'd even shared my opening story. She'd driven down from Springfield, Massachusetts, after hearing about the program from her therapist. Her 42-year-old son had been living in her basement for 3 years, ostensibly saving money for his own place while she covered his car payments, phone bill, and most of his living expenses. The pattern felt familiar because I'd heard variations of it dozens of times now. My story begins with a text message I wasn't supposed to see, I continued, sharing the condensed version of my experience with David and Christina that had become my standard opening. The faces around the room showed the recognition I'd come to expect, the relief of people discovering they weren't alone in their struggles, the pain of seeing their own situations reflected back at them. After I finished my introduction, I opened the floor for others to share their stories. The variety never ceased to amaze me, even after facilitating more than 50 of these sessions. There was Robert, a 78-year-old retired electrician, whose daughter kept borrowing money for her children's activities but never seemed able to pay it back. Maria, a single mother who'd been supporting her adult son's family while he pursued one failed business venture after another. James and Carol, a couple whose retirement savings had been depleted by repeatedly bailing out their gambling-addicted nephew. Each story carried the same underlying themes: good intentions gone wrong, boundaries that had eroded gradually over time, and the painful recognition that help given without limits could become a prison for both giver and receiver. The hardest part, Patricia said when her turn came, is that I know I'm not helping him anymore. But I'm terrified that if I stop, he'll end up homeless or worse. How do you take that risk with someone you love? It was a question I'd heard in various forms at every workshop, and one I'd struggled with personally during those early days. After cutting off David and Christina's financial support, my answer had evolved through experience and reflection. The risk you're worried about, that he'll fail if you stop helping, assumes something that may not be true, I replied gently. It assumes he's incapable of success without your intervention. But by continuing to rescue him from the consequences of his choices, you're preventing him from discovering his own capabilities. David looked up from his laptop, catching my eye briefly. We'd had this conversation many times during our monthly coffee meetings, examining how my years of financial support had actually undermined his confidence in his own abilities. He'd needed to prove to himself that he could handle adult responsibilities before he could truly feel like an adult. The workshop continued through its familiar rhythm, sharing stories, identifying patterns, discussing practical strategies for setting boundaries, and addressing the emotional challenges that came with changing long-established family dynamics. But what made this session different was the presence of success stories alongside the struggles. David and Christina weren't the only ones who'd benefited from learning to navigate financial independence. Over the months, I'd heard from former workshop participants who'd successfully changed their relationships with money-dependent family members. Janet, from that very first session, had helped her daughter find stable employment by stopping the monthly payments that had removed any urgency from her job search. George had connected his gambling-addicted son with professional help while maintaining boundaries around money that forced his son to take recovery seriously. The transformations weren't always smooth or immediate. Some relationships had been damaged, at least temporarily, when boundaries were established. Some adult children had initially become angry or resentful when parental financial support ended. But the families who'd stuck with the process generally found themselves in healthier, more honest relationships. As the formal workshop portion ended and people began gathering their materials, Patricia approached me with the tentative expression I'd learned to recognize. "Could I ask you something privately?" she said. I nodded, having learned that these individual conversations were often where the real breakthroughs happened. David noticed my signal and began herding the remaining participants toward the refreshment table Christina had set up in the adjoining room. "I understand the theory," Patricia said once we were alone. "I can see how my support might be enabling my son rather than helping him. But I just can't figure out how to actually do it. How do you suddenly stop helping someone you've been supporting for years without destroying your relationship?" It was the implementation question that stumped most people. Understanding the problem intellectually was different from finding the emotional strength to change long-established patterns. "It doesn't have to be sudden," I said, settling back into my chair. When I ended my financial support for David and Christina, it felt dramatic because I was reacting to a crisis moment. But that's not the only way to make changes. I shared some strategies I'd developed for gradual boundary setting, having honest conversations about financial dependence before implementing changes, setting clear timelines for transitioning to independence, offering non-financial support during the adjustment period. The key was communicating intentions clearly while remaining firm about outcomes. The conversation itself is often the hardest part, I continued. Once you tell your son that the financial support is ending and why, you've committed to following through. But you've also opened the door for a different kind of relationship. Patricia nodded thoughtfully. What if he gets angry? What if he stops talking to me? Then you'll know that your relationship was based primarily on what you could provide rather than who you are, I replied, the words carrying weight because I'd faced the same fear. And if that's the case, it wasn't really a healthy relationship anyway. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering practical concerns about timing, communication strategies, and ways to maintain emotional connection while establishing financial boundaries. By the time Patricia left, she had a specific plan for approaching her son and the confidence to begin implementing it. David appeared in the doorway as I was packing up my materials. "Ready to head out?" Christina's already loading the car. We'd developed this routine over recent months. David and Christina would help with workshop logistics, then we'd grab dinner together to debrief and catch up on family news. It had become one of my favorite parts of these events, not because I needed their help, but because I enjoyed their company and valued their insights. Over dinner at a small Italian restaurant near the community center, we reviewed the day's session. David had been tracking participant feedback, and the results were consistently positive. More importantly, he'd been following up with people from previous workshops and documenting their progress. Patricia reminds me of you 18 months ago, Christina observed, twirling pasta around her fork. That same mixture of understanding the problem intellectually but feeling paralyzed when it comes to actually changing things. I was terrified, I admitted. Even after I'd made the decision to cut off your financial support, I spent weeks wondering if I was making a terrible mistake. Were you? David asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. No, I said firmly. It was the best decision I could have made for all of us. But I couldn't have known that at the time. Christina reached across the table and squeezed my hand briefly. I'm grateful you took the risk. We all are. The gesture was simple but meaningful. Our relationship had evolved into something none of us could have predicted 18 months earlier, built on mutual respect rather than financial dependence, characterized by genuine affection rather than obligatory family loyalty. After dinner, driving home through the Connecticut hills painted in autumn colors, I reflected on how completely my life had changed. The woman who'd sat in her kitchen feeling hurt and unappreciated by her family's resentment seemed like someone from another lifetime. That Margaret had defined herself by her willingness to solve other people's problems. This Margaret was defined by her ability to help people solve their own problems. My phone rang as I pulled into my driveway, Joan's name appearing on the display. How did the workshop go? She asked without preamble. Really well. 23 people, lots of engagement, several breakthrough moments, I reported, gathering my materials from the passenger seat. Excellent. I'm calling because I have news that might interest you. Remember my friend Susan who moved to Florida last year? I did remember Susan, another book club member who'd relocated to be closer to her grandchildren but had maintained our friendship through regular phone calls. She's been telling people down there about your workshops, Joan continued. Apparently there's a huge demand for this kind of programming in retirement communities. She thinks you could easily fill a speaking calendar if you wanted to travel a bit. The suggestion was intriguing. I'd been considering ways to expand the program beyond Connecticut, but I'd been thinking in terms of training other facilitators rather than traveling myself. How much travel are we talking about? I asked. She mentioned communities in Florida, Arizona, North Carolina, basically anywhere there are concentrations of retirees dealing with adult children who never quite achieved independence. The compensation would be significant, and you'd be helping a lot more families than you can reach locally. I found myself genuinely excited by the possibility. Travel had been something Robert and I had planned for retirement but never quite achieved due to his illness. The idea of combining travel with meaningful work appealed to me tremendously. Let me think about it, I told Joan. I'd need to figure out logistics, make sure I could maintain my local commitments. Of course. But Margaret, I hope you'll seriously consider it. You've found something you're genuinely gifted at, something that makes a real difference in people's lives. Why not share that with as many people as possible? After we hung up, I sat in my car for a few more minutes, considering Joan's suggestion. The local workshops had been fulfilling beyond anything I'd imagined, but the idea of reaching a broader audience was compelling. How many families were struggling with financial enabling dynamics? How many Patricias were out there, loving someone, but not knowing how to love them in ways that promoted independence rather than dependence? Inside my house, I made myself a cup of tea and settled into Robert's old chair with my laptop. Over the past year, I'd been documenting not just the workshop content but also the outcomes, tracking participants' progress, noting which strategies worked best for different situations, refining my approach based on feedback and results. What I discovered as I reviewed my notes was that I'd essentially created a comprehensive program for addressing a problem that affected millions of families but was rarely discussed openly. The shame and guilt associated with financial enabling meant that most people struggled with these issues in isolation, just as I had during the worst periods with David and Christina. I opened a new document and began outlining what a broader program might look like. Regional workshops that could be customized for different communities. Training materials for other facilitators who wanted to offer the program in their areas. Maybe even a book that could reach people who couldn't attend workshops but needed the information and encouragement the program provided. The ideas flowed faster than I could type them. For the first time since Robert's death, I felt the kind Of excitement about the future that I remembered from our early marriage when we'd been building his business and planning our life together. This was different, obviously, it belonged entirely to me rather than being a shared venture. But the energy was familiar, the thrill of creating something meaningful, of building something that could outlast my own involvement. My phone buzzed. With a text from David, "Thanks for letting us help today. Christina and I were talking on the drive home about how proud we are to be part of what you're building. Love you, Mom." The message brought tears to my eyes, not from sadness but from joy. The relationship we'd built over the past year was so much richer than what we'd had before, even during the years when I'd thought we were close. The financial dependency had created an artificial dynamic that prevented us from truly knowing each other as adults. Now, working together on something we all cared about, I was discovering aspects of David and Christina's personalities I'd never seen before. David had revealed himself to be an excellent organizer with a genuine passion for helping families in crisis. Christina's marketing skills were matched by an unexpected empathy for people struggling with shame around money issues. They'd both grown tremendously through their own financial journey, and that growth had made them valuable contributors to the workshop program. More importantly, they'd learned to see me as a person rather than just as David's mother, someone with her own interests, talents, and dreams rather than someone whose primary identity was defined by her relationship to them. Over the following weeks, I developed a formal plan for expanding the workshop program. I researched retirement communities and community centers throughout the Southeast and Southwest, regions where large populations of retirees often dealt with financially dependent adult children. I created a proposal packet that included workshop descriptions, participant testimonials, and outcome data from my Connecticut sessions. The response was overwhelming. Within a month, I had requests for workshops from 12 different communities across 4 states. The compensation offers were indeed significant, enough to cover travel expenses and provide a substantial supplement to my already comfortable income. More importantly, the demand confirmed that this was a problem affecting families nationwide, not just in my corner of Connecticut. My first traveling workshop was scheduled for a retirement community outside Sarasota, Florida, in early December. As I prepared for the trip, I felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness that reminded me of my early workshop days in Westfield. Joan insisted on driving me to the airport, claiming she wanted to see me off on my national debut. As we sat in the departure lounge waiting for my flight to board, she reflected on the changes she'd witnessed in me over the past year and a half. "You know what I find most impressive about all this," she said, gesturing toward the materials case I was carrying. "It's not that you turned a painful experience into something positive, lots of people do that. It's that you had the courage to make yourself vulnerable in service of helping others." I considered her observation. The workshops did require a level of personal vulnerability that would have terrified me 2 years earlier. Sharing my story with groups of strangers, admitting my mistakes, acknowledging the ways I'd enabled David and Christina without realizing it, none of that came naturally to someone who'd spent years trying to be the perfect, supportive mother. "I think I finally learned the difference between being vulnerable and being weak," I replied. "Sharing my story isn't about exposing my failures, it's about showing people that change is possible even when the situation feels hopeless." The Florida workshop exceeded my expectations in every way. 47 people attended, representing families dealing with everything from adult children living in parental basements to grandparents supporting multiple generations through poor financial choices. The discussion was heated at times, emotional always, but ultimately productive in ways that left me energized rather than drained. During the break, a woman named Helen approached me with tears in her eyes. "I've been supporting my son's family for 8 years," she said. "Paying their rent, buying groceries, covering their utility bills. I knew it wasn't helping them become independent, but I didn't know how to stop without feeling like I was abandoning my grandchildren." Her story was achingly familiar, differing only in details from dozens of others I'd heard. But what struck me was her relief at finally having permission to change the situation, and practical strategies for doing so without destroying family relationships. "The guilt is the hardest part," Helen continued. "Everyone tells you that family should always come first, that you should help your children no matter what. But nobody talks about what happens when that help stops being helpful." That comment crystallized something I'd been thinking about throughout the development of the program. Society offered plenty of messages about family loyalty and unconditional love, but very little guidance about when love might require saying no, when support might need to include accountability, when helping might actually be harming. The success of the Florida workshop led to invitations from communities throughout the region. Over the following months, I found myself traveling regularly, sometimes just for weekend workshops, sometimes for week-long residencies that allowed for more intensive programming. Each location brought new insights and challenges. The retirement communities attracted primarily older participants dealing with adult children, but community centers often drew multi-generational audiences where both enablers and enabled could attend together. Those sessions were more complex but often more transformative, allowing family members to hear each other's perspectives in a structured, supportive environment. One particularly memorable workshop in Phoenix included 3 generations of the same family: grandmother Ruth, who'd been supporting her daughter's household for 5 years, daughter Michelle, who'd never managed to achieve financial stability despite having a college degree and work experience, and Michelle's 18-year-old son Jake, who was about to leave for college with no understanding of how money actually worked because it had always appeared when needed throughout his childhood. The 3-way conversation that emerged during that session was painful but necessary. Ruth finally understood how her rescue efforts had prevented Michelle from learning to manage crises independently. Michelle recognized that her resentment toward her mother's help masked her own shame about not being able to support her family alone. Jake realized that his assumption that financial problems would always be solved by someone else had left him completely unprepared for adult responsibilities. By the end of the day, they developed a plan for transitioning to financial independence that included timeline, accountability measures, and ongoing emotional support that didn't involve money. 6 months later, Ruth sent me a letter reporting that Michelle had found a better job and was successfully managing her budget independently, while Jake was working part-time at college and learning to live within his earnings. Stories like theirs reinforced my conviction that the work I was doing addressed a genuine need that wasn't being met by traditional financial counseling or family therapy. The intersection of money and family dynamics required specialized understanding and techniques that I'd developed through personal experience and refined through practice. By spring, the program had grown beyond anything I'd originally envisioned. I was facilitating workshops in 8 states, training other facilitators to offer the program in their communities, and working on a book proposal that would make the core concepts available to an even broader audience. David and Christina had become integral to the program's operations, with David managing the growing database of participants and outcome tracking while Christina handled marketing and publicity. They'd both taken leave from their regular jobs to work on the program full-time, not because they needed the income but because they'd found their own sense of purpose in helping families navigate financial dynamics. The irony wasn't lost on any of us that their volunteer work for my program had become more fulfilling than their previous careers, or that working together had strengthened our family relationships in ways that pure social interaction never could have achieved. One evening in late May, as I was preparing for a workshop series in North Carolina, David called with news that surprised me. "Christina and I have been talking," he began, "and we'd like to propose something that might sound crazy." "I'm listening," I replied, setting aside the materials I'd been reviewing. "We want to move the program headquarters to a larger space and formalize it as a nonprofit organization," he said. "We've run the numbers, and we think we could serve significantly more families if we had proper infrastructure and funding." The suggestion caught me completely off guard. I'd been thinking of the workshop program as my personal project, something I did because I found it meaningful rather than as an organization that could take on a life of its own. "What would that involve?" I asked. "Office space, administrative staff, a proper website with online resources, maybe even an online version of the workshops for people who can't attend in person," David explained. "Christina's been researching grant opportunities, and there's significant funding available for programs that address financial literacy and family stability." "And you'd want to run this organization?" "We'd want to build it with you," Christina's voice added. Apparently I was on speakerphone. "You'd remain the primary content developer and face of the program, but we'd handle the business side so you could focus on what you do best." I found myself simultaneously intrigued and overwhelmed by the possibility. Creating a formal organization would allow the program to reach exponentially more families, but it would also change the nature of what I was doing from personal mission to institutional responsibility. "Let me think about it," I said finally. "It's a big step." "Of course. But Mom, we really believe this could be something significant. The need is enormous, and you've proven that your approach works. Why not give it the platform it deserves?" After we hung up, I walked out to my back garden, where the roses Robert had planted years earlier were beginning their annual explosion of color and fragrance. The evening air was soft with the promise of summer, and the setting sun painted everything in gentle gold light. The decision before me felt momentous in ways that went beyond the practical considerations of organizational structure and funding. Creating a formal nonprofit would mean fully committing to this work as the central focus of my remaining years. It would mean believing that what I'd learned through my painful experience with David and Christina could benefit thousands of other families facing similar challenges. More than that, it would mean embracing an identity I'd never imagined for myself, not just Margaret the mother or Margaret the widow, but Margaret the educator, the advocate, the leader of a movement to change how families think about money and independence. The phone rang, interrupting my contemplation. Rebecca's name appeared on the display. "I hope I'm not calling too late," my sister said. "I just got off the phone with David. He told me about the nonprofit proposal." "And what do you think?" I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. "I think it's brilliant," Rebecca replied without hesitation. "And I think you'd be crazy not to do it." "Why?" "Because you've found your calling, Maggie. How many people get a second chance to discover what they're truly meant to do? You've built something meaningful from one of the most painful experiences of your life. Now you have the opportunity to take it as far as it can go." Her words resonated deeply. I'd been thinking about the nonprofit proposal in terms of practical considerations, funding, staffing, organizational structure. But Rebecca was right that the real question was about purpose and legacy. What did I want the rest of my life to accomplish? "I'm scared," I admitted. "What if I'm not capable of running an organization? What if I fail?" "What if you succeed beyond your wildest dreams?" Rebecca countered. "What if you help transform the lives of thousands of families? What if you create something that continues helping people long after you're gone?" The possibility she described was both thrilling and terrifying. I'd never seen myself as someone who could create lasting change in the world. But the evidence was difficult to argue with. The workshops were consistently successful, demand far exceeded my current capacity, and the transformation I'd witnessed in participating families proved that the approach worked. That night, I made a list of every family whose situation had improved through the workshop program. Janet and her daughter who'd finally found stable employment. George and his son who'd entered serious addiction treatment. Ruth, Michelle, and Jake who'd learned to function as independent adults within a supportive family structure. Dozens of others whose lives had been genuinely changed by learning to distinguish between helping and enabling. By morning, I'd made my decision. 3 months later, the Margaret Whitmore Foundation for Financial Family Wellness opened its doors in a renovated office building in downtown Hartford. David served as executive director, Christina managed communications and outreach, and I held the title of founder and chief program officer. We'd hired 2 additional staff members, a former social worker who specialized in family dynamics and a financial counselor with experience in addiction recovery, to help develop specialized programs for different populations. The foundation's mission statement, which I'd written after weeks of careful consideration, read, "To help families distinguish between love and enablement, teaching financial independence as an expression of genuine care rather than a withdrawal of support." Our first major initiative was a comprehensive online program that could reach families anywhere in the country. Our second was a training curriculum for professionals, therapists, financial planners, clergy, and others who worked with families struggling with money-related dependence issues. But what gave me the most satisfaction was the continuation of the in-person workshops, now offered in more than 30 locations across 15 states. Each session reminded me why I'd started this work. The relief on faces when people realized they weren't alone in their struggles, the breakthrough moments when participants understood the difference between helping and harming, the follow-up reports of families who'd successfully transitioned to healthier financial relationships. 6 months after the foundation launched, I received a letter that captured everything I'd hoped to achieve. It was from Patricia, the woman who'd driven from Springfield to that Hartford workshop 2 years earlier. "Dear Margaret," she wrote, "I wanted to update you on how things have worked out with my son. Following the plan we discussed after your workshop, I gradually transitioned him to financial independence over a 6-month period. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, watching him struggle, resisting the urge to rescue him when things got difficult. But you were right about everything. Once he realized the money wasn't coming anymore, he found resources within himself that neither of us knew existed. He got a better job, found his own apartment, and started managing his own finances. More importantly, our relationship is stronger now than it's been in years. He respects me as a person rather than seeing me as a source of money, and I respect him as an adult who's capable of handling his own life. Thank you for giving me permission to love my son in a way that actually helped him grow up." The workshop changed both our lives. Reading Patricia's letter while sitting in my foundation office, surrounded by evidence of how much the program had grown and how many families it was now serving, I felt a profound sense of completion. The journey that had begun with a hurtful text message about suffocating independence had led to something I never could have imagined, a life purpose that combined everything I'd learned about money, family, and the complex relationship between love and boundaries. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma, now 8 years old and increasingly articulate about her thoughts and feelings. "Grandma, Dad says you're helping lots of families now. I'm proud that you're my grandma." The simple message brought tears to my eyes. This was what I'd wanted all along, not gratitude for financial assistance, but recognition for who I was as a person. Emma saw me as someone who helped people, someone who made a difference in the world, someone to be proud of rather than just someone who provided things. That evening, David, Christina, and I had dinner together to celebrate the Foundation's 6-month anniversary. As we sat around the table in their modest but comfortable home, I reflected on how dramatically all our lives had changed since that painful confrontation in my living room 2.5 years earlier. "I need to ask you something," I said, as we finished our meal. "Do you ever regret how things worked out? Do you ever wish I'd continued helping you financially instead of forcing you to become independent?" David and Christina exchanged a look before David answered. "Never," he said firmly. "The struggle was hard, but it was necessary. We learned things about ourselves we never would have discovered if you'd kept rescuing us." "Besides," Christina added, "look what came out of it. You found your calling, we found our purpose working with the Foundation, and our kids get to see all their adults doing meaningful work instead of just going through the motions." She was right. Emma and Samuel were growing up watching their parents and grandmother tackle challenges, solve problems, and help other people. They were learning that adults could change, grow, and find new directions even later in life. Those were lessons worth more than any financial inheritance I could have left them. As I drove home that night, I thought about the text message that had started it all. "She's at it again, swooping in to save the day. I swear, Margaret acts like we can't handle our own finances. It's suffocating how she hovers over every little thing." Christina had been right, though neither of us understood it at the time. I had been suffocating their independence by constantly rescuing them from consequences. But the solution hadn't been for me to stop caring, it had been for me to care. In ways that built their strength rather than undermining it. By suffocating their access to my money, I had given them space to breathe and grow on their own. And by refusing to be diminished by their resentment of my help, I had discovered a version of myself that was larger, more capable, and more purposeful than I'd ever imagined possible. The Margaret who'd sat in her kitchen feeling hurt and unappreciated seemed like someone from another lifetime. This Margaret had work to do, lives to impact, and a legacy to build that had nothing to do with how much money she could spend on other people's problems. I'd learned that the greatest gift you can give someone you love isn't financial security, it's confidence in their ability to create that security for themselves. And the greatest gift you can give yourself is the courage to discover who you are when you're no longer defined by what others need from you. My phone lit up with another message as I pulled into my driveway, this one from Joan, book club emergency. Eleanor wants to change next month's selection to a romance novel. Need backup immediately. Democracy hangs in the balance. I laughed out loud, typing back, on my way to save democracy. And I have the perfect alternative suggestion, a book about reinventing yourself after 70. As I headed toward my front door, I realized I was looking forward to defending my literary position with the same energy I brought to facilitating workshops. Every aspect of my life now belonged fully to me, my friendships, my work, my time, my choices. I was no longer waiting for other people to need me or resenting them when they did. I was simply living the life I'd chosen to build, one meaningful day at a time. The house felt welcoming rather than empty as I turned on the lights and settled into my evening routine. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new families to help, new opportunities to share what I'd learned about the complicated relationship between love and money. But tonight, I was content to sit in the quiet satisfaction of a day well lived and a future full of possibilities I was excited to explore. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.